example, and the analogy we've used on several occasions, has to do with a very common problem that doctors, primary care physicians, as well as specialists, encounter when managing patients with type 2 diabetes. In such cases, they're often ill-defined. The patient condition can change very quickly, sometimes overnight, where, in a very practical sense, there's more than one right answer about what to do, and where clinicians will honestly disagree about the best course of action. So it's a very complex issue. It's very difficult to pin down from a mastery learning framework, but this is a real challenge for those of us who labor in this vineyard. And if you read the book titled Peak, written by the late Anders Ericsson and Robert Poole, they talk about working in what they call a highly developed field like medicine, where in order to make advances educationally and sometimes clinically, we must have objective ways to measure performance that permit rigorous teaching and assessment in like a mastery learning framework to improve physician performance in patient care practices. And that our mastery learning interventions can't work well unless we have solid metrics that allow us to measure performance and provide feedback to learners so that they can constantly improve what they do on behalf of the patients that they're privileged to serve. So this whole issue of developing metrics is really critical, and a lot of thought and attention needs to be devoted to just this issue, not only regarding diabetes care, but the list goes on in terms of heart disease and epilepsy and geriatrics, you name it. Being able to measure the acquisition of skills and especially to provide feedback for improvement is an absolutely essential step that must be taken if the idea of mastery learning is going to advance. Jeff, can you amplify that as a clinician?
Well, it is very difficult, I do agree. And two of the areas that, as you know, we're about to tackle ourselves and try and create simulation-based mastery learning curricula for include diabetes management by clinicians, as well as clinical decision-making.
That's right.
In the event that a patient has to have what we call a rapid response or starts to deteriorate fast. And we believe we can do that through a series of OSCEs and several very carefully created assessment tools that are both rigorous in their reliability and their validity as to the data they produce.
Right you are. And this addresses not just the complex conditions that clinicians have to address, but also, as Jeff, as you've alluded to, the physician or the caregivers, the health professionals, what we call adaptive capacity, the ability to change course, to recognize problems as they arise, to respond quickly in terms of recognizing problems, engaging in fast reasoning, and what we call deft responses. Intraoperative judgment by the surgeon is a prime example of this, but there are many, many others in healthcare that clinicians address. These are knotty problems that arise every day. So addressing adaptive capacities, reasoning on the fly, adjustment, these are all things that pose big measurement problems that won't go away, but from the standpoint of an educational developer, they are at once a problem, but also an opportunity for further work. Jeff?
So, Bill, another topic that you mentioned at the beginning was about team-based training, and that's also a very complex situation because I don't know that anyone has really figured out how to properly assess teams yet. So you mentioned that. So you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure. Well, healthcare, as we know, is a team-based enterprise. It's rarely done by individuals anymore. And so it's important to provide training opportunities in the same way that healthcare is provided on the floors and in the clinics. So we need to do a lot of work to figure out how the mastery learning model can address team-based competencies, as our good friend and colleague Eduardo Salas and his group have done at Rice University in Houston, to amplify, to extend their work, to learn not only about team-based competencies in the short run in the training environment, but also how they apply to patient care practices and hopefully their impact on patient outcomes downstream. So in addition to that, there are a couple of other research opportunities that I'd like to point out that I think are really critical, since we can't address everything that's in Chapter 21. But I think it's also important within the mastery learning environment to realize that a key person or persons within that framework are the instructors themselves. And that the teaching skills within a mastery learning environment are very, very different from the skills that one needs when giving a lecture or leading a discussion group or running a problem-based learning group and so forth. Teaching skills in a mastery learning environment have to do with rigorous instruction planning, curriculum development, and serving within the mastery learning environment in a rigorous coaching and feedback capacity. Instructors in mastery learning are not at all passive. Instruction in mastery learning is a very active enterprise that involves a lot of sweating on behalf of the teacher as well as the learner, who, by the way, in a mastery environment, as we all know, is working very, very hard. And it also means that we have to think about who the instructor should be based upon the functional needs rather than credentials. And in many cases, some of the most important, the most effective instructors for, say, for example, medical education need not be physicians. Individual instructors can be other health professionals, technicians, people from a variety of education backgrounds who are there to do everything possible to facilitate the development of the learners, and their credentials don't matter. And that's a key issue. You don't have to have doctors to educate doctors, which is very similar to the way pilots are educated today. I mean, it's only at the very tail end of pilot training that another certified pilot is actually side by side with the pilot in training in the cockpit. Most of the early training is done in simulation environments involving technical people. So instructor training and preparation is a key need, a key research and development need within the mastery learning environment, and we need to have a broad understanding of who can serve in that role.
And then, Bill, I think we were going to wrap it up by talking about artificial intelligence. And I know that is getting really big in medicine. Now there are devices such as echocardiograms that you can do at the bedside that will actually interpret the findings for you. And we're going to have all kinds of new technologies like that are coming out that we're going to have to get with the times and start training people on. So why don't we talk about that a little?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, not only in the mastery learning environment, but in healthcare and health professions education in general, the impact of new technologies is huge and is growing day by day. And we simply have to do a better job of, number one, understanding the interface between the human skill sets that are embodied in physicians and other healthcare providers, as well as these new technologies that will help the humans do their job better. Artificial intelligence is only one example. There have been huge breakthroughs, and there continue to be breakthroughs in using AI, for example, for diagnostics, variety of other approaches within healthcare, and working out that human AI interface is going to be crucial, not only in the short run, but as healthcare advances downstream. Now, that's a snowballing effect that is simply beyond the control of individual curriculum committees, but we are foolish not to acknowledge the importance of AI. We've talked a lot about artificial intelligence and other advanced technologies. These are not the issues of the future; they're issues of the present, and we simply have to acknowledge not only their impact, but as well as their future the way in the future that they'll be shaping our curricula as well as our thinking and the provision of healthcare down the road. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to close on kind of a lofty note by saying that we need to do a better job of integrating medical education research, of which mastery learning is only one part, with a loftier goal of health services research. That if our education research is to be useful, it has to have an impact, what we call downstream in terms of patient care practices and patient outcomes. These are translational science issues that will marry medical education research and health services research for many years to come. It all begins, however, by demonstrating the effects of powerful education interventions in controlled simulation laboratories. That's always the first step. It's what we call T1 outcomes. Given that we can demonstrate those powerful effects under controlled laboratory conditions, then we're in a situation where we can try to strengthen our interventions so that we can demonstrate their power and utility in downstream ways in terms of better patient care practices, better patient outcomes, and the collateral effects that we mentioned earlier in regard to, for example, the VAD studies. This is an empirical cascade where we must demonstrate the results first in the laboratory and then later in terms of patient care practices, patient outcomes, and collateral effects as well. We've written about this, and these are exciting times to consider not only education research, but in terms of their long-term impacts on the welfare of patients. And what's curious, Jeff, is that it's been assumed for many, many years that education interventions in medicine and the other health fields, well, of course, they pay off in terms of better patient care practices, but it's never been studied. It's always been assumed that what we teach people and the learning that they acquire, if at all, in the clinical environment using old-fashioned apprenticeship methods have a direct effect on patient care, and we know that that link has not been established at all, and that the more we study it, the more we realize that the current traditional practices of clinical education are obsolete and just don't work very well.
Well, Bill, that is all really great information. Thanks for going through the book chapter, and thanks for doing our final podcast in this series.
That's my pleasure, Jeff. It's always a joy to work with you and our Northwestern colleagues on important simulation-based mastery learning research and development.
Thank you for listening today. This concludes our podcast series covering our book called Comprehensive Healthcare Simulation, Mastery Learning, and Health Professions Education. We hope you'll get yourself a copy and read it through. And look forward to our next series of podcasts where we will continue to discuss key aspects of simulation healthcare education with experts in the field. Bye for now.